The British political landscape just shattered into a million pieces. Nigel Farage, the man they said would never break through, the politician they dismissed as a protest voice, has done the impossible. Reform UK has stormed to power with a commanding 74-seat majority, ending decades of two-party dominance in Westminster. This isn't just an election result. This is a political earthquake that's rewriting the rules of British democracy. The establishment parties are in free fall, traditional voters have abandoned ship, and the country is waking up to a reality nobody saw coming. What happened in those final 72 hours before polling day? How did Farage pull off the greatest political comeback in modern British history? And what does this mean for Britain's future? The answers are more shocking than anyone could have predicted. The numbers tell a story that political analysts are still struggling to comprehend. Reform UK didn't just win this election, they obliterated the competition in a way that defies every prediction, every poll, and every expert opinion from the past 3 years. When the exit polls dropped at 10 p.m. on election night, newsrooms across Britain fell into stunned silence. Reform UK projected to win 348 seats, the Conservatives reduced to just 89, Labour holding a mere 142, the Liberal Democrats clinging to 38. These weren't the numbers anyone expected, and they certainly weren't the numbers the mainstream media had been preparing the public for. But as the night unfolded and constituency after constituency turned Reform blue, the reality became impossible to deny. Nigel Farage had achieved what Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair and even Winston Churchill never managed: a complete realignment of British politics in a single election cycle. The scale of this victory is unprecedented in post-war British history. Reform UK captured seats in areas that had been Labour strongholds for over a century. Mining communities in the north that had never voted Conservative suddenly turned to Farage. Coastal towns, market cities, suburban constituencies, and even urban areas that were supposed to be safe for the establishment parties all fell like dominoes. The swing toward Reform UK averaged 23 points nationally, but in some constituencies it reached as high as 35 points. These aren't normal numbers, these are the kind of numbers you see during revolutionary moments in democratic history, the kind of numbers that indicate a complete loss of faith in the existing political system and a desperate hunger for something radically different. What makes this victory even more remarkable is the speed at which it materialised. Just 18 months ago, Reform UK was polling at 7% nationally. Political commentators were writing them off as a fringe movement that would fade once the Brexit debate moved further into the rearview mirror. Farage himself had stepped back from frontline politics, seemingly content to comment from the sidelines. But then something changed. The cost of living crisis deepened. Immigration numbers reached record highs despite Brexit promises. The NHS waiting list stretched to breaking point. Energy bills doubled, then tripled, and with each passing month, the gap between what politicians promised and what they delivered grew wider. The British people were crying out for accountability, for someone who would speak plainly about the problems they faced every day. And the establishment parties offered them nothing but the same tired rhetoric and broken promises. Farage sensed the moment. In March of last year, he announced his return to politics with a speech that sent shockwaves through Westminster. He didn't mince words, he didn't offer platitudes. He laid out a vision for Britain that was controversial, confrontational, and completely at odds with the political consensus that had dominated for decades. The media attacked him relentlessly. Opposition politicians called him dangerous, divisive, a threat to democracy itself. But with every attack, his support grew because millions of British voters had stopped trusting the media, stopped believing the establishment, and started looking for someone who would actually fight for them rather than lecture them about what they should think. Farage became that voice, and Reform UK became the vehicle for the most dramatic political transformation Britain has seen since the 1945 Labour landslide. The campaign itself was unlike anything British politics had witnessed before. Farage didn't rely on traditional campaign strategies. He didn't spend millions on glossy TV advertisements or celebrity endorsements. Instead, he went directly to the people, town halls in forgotten communities, factory visits in deindustrialised regions, pub meetings in villages the London elite had never heard of. He listened more than he spoke in those early days, and what he heard confirmed everything he suspected. The British people felt abandoned by their political class, betrayed by promises that were never kept, and furious at being told their concerns about immigration, sovereignty and national identity were somehow bigoted or backward. Farage didn't dismiss these concerns. He validated them, amplified them and built a political movement around them. By the time the official campaign period began, Reform UK had already won the argument in the courts of public opinion. The establishment parties made catastrophic miscalculations at every turn. The Conservatives, still reeling from years of internal division and leadership chaos, tried to out-reform reform by adopting watered-down versions of Farage's policies. It was too little, too late, and voters saw right through it. Why vote for the imitation when you can have the real thing? Labour, meanwhile, stuck to their metropolitan worldview, convinced that appeals to progressive values and economic redistribution would carry them through. They completely misread the mood of their traditional working-class base, who had long since stopped seeing Labour as the party of working people. The Liberal Democrats remained trapped in their narrow lane of middle-class Remainers and urban Liberals, irrelevant to the broader national conversation. None of them understood what Farage had grasped instinctively. This election wasn't about left versus right anymore. It was about the establishment versus the people, and the people were ready to burn the establishment to the ground. The path to this stunning victory wasn't smooth, and there were moments when it seemed like the entire weight of the British establishment was mobilised to stop Reform UK from reaching power. 3 weeks before polling day, a coordinated media offensive began. Every major newspaper except two ran front-page stories warning about the dangers of a Farage government. Television debates were structured to isolate him, with other party leaders ganging up to attack reform policies as extreme, unworkable, or economically reckless. Former prime ministers from both major parties made joint appearances urging voters not to risk Britain's future with reform. Business leaders issued dire warnings about economic chaos. Even members of the royal household in carefully worded statements seemed to be signalling concern about political instability. It was an unprecedented closing of ranks, a collective panic from everyone who had something to lose from a Farage victory. But it backfired spectacularly. Every attack on Farage reminded voters exactly why they wanted change in the first place. Here was the entire establishment, the same establishment that had led Britain into the Iraq War, that had bailed out the banks while ordinary people lost their homes, that had presided over declining living standards and collapsing public services, and they were all united in their opposition to the one politician who threatened their cosy consensus. For millions of voters, that wasn't a warning, it was an endorsement. If the establishment hated Farage this much, he must be doing something right. The more they attacked him, the more his poll numbers climbed. By the final week of the campaign, Reform UK was pulling ahead in constituencies that were supposed to be completely safe for the Conservatives and Labour. Panic set in at their campaign headquarters, but there was nothing they could do. The momentum was unstoppable. The final debate, broadcast 4 days before polling, sealed the deal. Farage stood on that stage, flanked by the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and the other party leaders. And he didn't just win the debate, he transcended it. When the Conservative leader attacked him on immigration policy, Farage shot back with devastating precision, listing every broken promise the Conservatives had made on immigration over 14 years in government. When the Labour leader questioned his economic credibility, Farage detailed exactly how both Labour and Conservative governments had racked up trillions in debt, while ordinary families struggled. When the moderator asked him about his controversial statements, he didn't apologise or backtrack. He doubled down, explaining in clear, simple terms why he believed what he believed and why millions of British people agreed with him. It was a masterclass in political communication, and the instant polls showed he had won overwhelmingly. More importantly, undecided voters broke for Reform UK in huge numbers in the days that followed. Election day itself dawned with a sense of historical weight. Polling stations across Britain reported record turnout from the moment they opened at 7 a.m. In working class areas, queues formed before dawn, with voters determined to have their say after years of feeling ignored and taken for granted. The mood was electric, charged with an energy that veterans of British elections said they'd never witnessed before. This wasn't just people performing their civic duty. This was people seizing a once-in-a-generation chance to completely upend a political system they felt had failed them. Exit polls throughout the day suggested something extraordinary was happening, but even the most optimistic Reform UK campaigners didn't dare believe the scale of what was coming. They'd been burned before by hope, by promises that this time would be different. But as the polls closed at 10 p.m. and the exit poll projection flashed across television screens, the impossible became undeniable. The first results came from safe Labour seats in the North East that had been red for generations. Sunderland, always first to declare, showed a massive swing to Reform UK. They didn't win the seat, but the 18-point swing sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Then Newcastle declared another huge swing. Then Blythe Valley, a seat Labour had held since 1950, fell to Reform UK with a 12,000 vote majority. The pattern was set, and over the next few hours it repeated itself across the country with relentless consistency. Every region, every type of constituency, every demographic group showed movement toward Farage's party. The Conservatives were being wiped out in their rural heartlands. Labour was collapsing in post-industrial cities. The Liberal Democrats were reduced to a handful of wealthy suburbs, and Reform UK was winning everywhere else. By 3 a.m, with half the results declared, it was clear this wasn't just a Reform UK victory, it was a Reform UK landslide of historic proportions. The party had crossed the threshold of 326 seats needed for a majority and was still climbing. Farage himself won his constituency of Clacton with over 60% of the vote, a result that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. In his victory speech delivered to a crowd of thousands in the early hours of the morning, he was magnanimous but firm. He thanked the British people for their trust, promised to govern for everyone regardless of how they voted, but also made clear that this mandate was for radical change, not tinkering around the edges. The old way of doing politics was dead, he declared, and a new era had begun. The shock of Reform UK's victory has sent political aftershocks across the entire Western world. Within hours of the result being confirmed, governments from Washington to Berlin to Canberra were scrambling to understand what had just happened and what it meant for their own political futures. Because what happened in Britain wasn't just a British story, it was a warning to every establishment party in every democracy that has spent decades ignoring the concerns of ordinary working people while pursuing globalist agendas that benefited elites. The populist wave that Brexit hinted at, that Trump's 2016 victory suggested, has now crashed over Britain with such force that the entire political landscape has been reshaped beyond recognition, and politicians around the world are terrified they might be next. In Brussels, the reaction bordered it on panic. The European Union had spent years hoping Britain would eventually come crawling back, that Brexit would prove such a disaster that the British public would demand to rejoin. Farage's victory has killed that dream stone dead. His first major policy announcement during the campaign was a promise to diverge even further from EU regulations, to pursue aggressive trade deals with non-EU countries, and to position Britain as a genuinely independent nation that refuses to be constrained by the Brussels bureaucracy. For EU leaders, this is a nightmare scenario. If Britain not only survives outside the EU, but actually thrives under a hardline Brexiteer government, it provides a template for Eurosceptic parties across the continent. Marine Le Pen in France, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and right-wing movements in the Netherlands, Austria and Sweden are all watching the British experiment with keen interest. And if it succeeds, the entire European project could face an existential crisis. In the United States, since the reaction has been more complex. The Biden administration, still in power when the election happened, issued a carefully neutral statement congratulating Farage, but expressing hope that the special relationship between Britain and America would continue. Behind closed doors, however, senior Democrats were deeply worried. Farage had been a vocal Trump supporter, had appeared at Trump rallies, and had maintained close ties with conservative populist movements across America. A Reform UK government represented a major shift in British foreign policy toward a more nationalist, America First style approach that would prioritise British interests over international cooperation. But for Republicans and the broader conservative movement in America, Farage's victory was a cause for celebration and validation. Here was proof that populist nationalism could win decisive democratic mandates, that the media and establishment opposition could be overcome, and that a political outsider could actually deliver the radical change they promised. The immediate economic reaction was equally dramatic. The pound sterling plunged on currency markets as traders panicked about uncertainty and potential economic disruption. Stock markets tumbled. Business groups issued warnings about investment freezing and companies relocating. The same doom-laden predictions that had been made about Brexit came roaring back, amplified by the fact that Farage represented an even more radical break with the economic orthodoxy than Brexit had. But within 48 hours, something interesting started to happen. The pound stabilised. Markets began to recover, and some major investors started talking about the potential opportunities in a Britain that was willing to cut regulations, reduce business taxes, and pursue economic growth over environmental and social governance priorities. The long-term economic impact remains uncertain, but the initial panic gave way to a grudging acknowledgement that Britain wasn't about to collapse into chaos simply because it had elected an unconventional government. Back in Britain, the losing parties began their painful reckonings. The Conservative Party, reduced to under 90 seats, faced the worst defeat in its nearly 200-year history. Their leader resigned immediately, and a brutal leadership contest began among the survivors, with different factions blaming each other for the catastrophe. Some argued that they had lost because they weren't conservative enough, that they should have adopted Farage's policies years ago. Others insisted they had lost because they pandered too much to the right and alienated moderate voters. The truth, which many Conservatives were reluctant to admit, was simpler. They had lost because they had been in power for 14 years and had failed to deliver on almost every promise they had made. Immigration was higher, not lower. The economy was weaker, not stronger. Public services were crumbling, not improving. No amount of repositioning could overcome that record of failure. Labour's defeat was equally crushing and perhaps even more significant for the long-term trajectory of British politics. They had believed with almost religious certainty that the conservative chaos of recent years would hand them power almost by default. Instead, they finished a distant third in seats and second in vote share, behind Reform UK in both metrics. Their core working class vote had abandoned them in droves, seeing the party as more interested in identity politics, climate activism, and appealing to urban progressives than in the bread and butter economic issues that mattered to ordinary families. The post-election analysis revealed that Labour had lost working class voters to Reform UK at a rate of nearly 3-1 compared to any other party. Their coalition had fractured beyond repair, and rebuilding it would require a fundamental rethinking of what the Labour Party stood for and who it represented. As the dust settled and Farage began the process of forming his government, the scale of the task ahead became clear. Reform UK had won a commanding majority, but they were still a relatively new party without the deep infrastructure, experienced personnel, or established relationships that traditional governing parties could rely on. Many of their newly elected MPs were political novices, people from business, military backgrounds, or local activism who had never held national office before. Farage himself, for all his political experience and communication skills, had never been in government and now had to assemble a cabinet, develop detailed policies, and manage the machinery of the British state. The establishment was waiting for him to fail, to prove that populist outsiders couldn't actually govern effectively. But Farage had spent his entire career defying expectations and proving doubters wrong. The question wasn't whether he would face challenges. The question was whether he could overcome them the way he had overcome everything else.